武士的女儿第3章。我小时候没有幼儿园，但早在我被新的6岁后才能入学的学校录取之前，我就为后来学习历史和文学奠定了良好的基础。我的祖母是一位伟大的读者，在下着大雪的漫漫冬夜，我们这些孩子们花了很多时间在她的火箱周围听故事。通过这种方式，在很小的时候，我就熟悉了神话故事，熟悉了日本最伟大的历史人物的生活，以及许多最佳小说的故事大纲。我还从祖母那里学到了很多古老的经典戏剧。我妹妹接受了女孩的常规教育，但我的教育是按照不同的路线规划的。因为我注定要成为一名女祭司，我生来就有肚脐带，像祭司的念珠一样缠绕在脖子上。在那些日子里，这是一种常见的迷信，意味着是佛陀的直接命令。我的祖母和我的母亲都真诚地相信这一点。由于在日本家庭中，房子和孩子的统治权留给了妇女，我父亲默默地听从于祖母的真诚愿望，也就是希望我接受女祭司的教育。然而，他选择了一位他认识的祭司作为我的老师，一位非常有学术的人。他很少花时间教我寺庙崇拜的形式，但特别认真地教导我孔子教义，这被认为是当时所有文学文化的基础。我父亲也认为这是当时最高的道德教义。
Chapter 3 Days of Khan. We did not have kindergartens when I was a child, but long before the time when I could have been admitted to the new after the 6th birthday school, I had acquired a goodly foundation for later study of history and literature. My grandmother was a great reader, and during the shut-in evenings of the long, snowy winters, we children spent the outline stories of many of our best novels. Also, I learned much of the old classic dramas from grandmother's lips. My sister received the usual education for girls, but mine was planned along different lines for the reason that I was supposed to be destined for a priestess. I had been born with the navel cord looped around the neck like a priest's rosary, and it was a common superstition in those days that this was a direct command from Buddha. Both my grandmother and my mother sincerely believed this, and since in a Japanese home, the ruling of the house and the children is left to the women, my father silently bowed to the earnest wish of my grandmother to have me educated for a priestess. He, however, selected for my teacher a priest whom he knew, a very scholarly man who spent little time in teaching me the forms of temple worship, but instructed me most conscientiously in the doctrine of Confucius. This was considered the foundation of all literary culture, and was believed by my father to be the highest moral teaching of the time.
我的老师总是在带有3和7的日子来，也就是每个月的第3、7、13、17、23和27号。这符合我们的农历习惯，把日子分成几十组，而不是像太阳历那样分成7组。我非常喜欢我的课程， 我的老师庄严的外表、举止的仪态，以及要求我僵硬的服从，吸引了我戏剧性的本能。然后，周围的环境给我幼稚的头脑留下了深刻的印象。在我上课那天，房间总是特别小心地准备就绪。当我进入房间时，我总是看到相同的景象，即使我现在闭上眼睛，脑海里浮现的一切都很清楚，就像我1小时前看到的一样。
My teacher always came on the days of 3s and 7s. That is, the 3rd, 7th, 13th, 17th, 23rd, and 27th. This was in accordance with our moon calendar custom of dividing days into groups of 10s instead of 7s, as is done by the sun calendar. I enjoyed my lessons very much. The stateliness of my teacher's appearance, the ceremony of his manner, and the rigid obedience required of me appealed to my dramatic instinct. Then the surroundings were most impressive to my childish mind. The room was always made ready with especial care the day of my lessons, and when I entered, invariably I saw the same sight. I close my eyes now, and all is as clear as if I had seen it but an hour ago.
房间宽敞明亮，与花园门廊隔开的是一排滑动的纸门，上面交叉着细长的木条。黑边的稻草垫随着时间的推移变成了奶油色，但没有灰尘沾染，看起来依旧是完美无瑕的。那里有书和书桌，在神圣的壁笼里挂着一张孔子的卷轴。在此之前，有一个小柚木摊位，从中升起一股卷曲的香雾。我的老师在一侧坐着，他飘逸的灰色长袍放在他折叠的双膝上，线条端庄，肩膀上戴着一条金色锦缎，左手腕上戴着一串水晶念珠。他的脸总是苍白的，祭司帽下深邃而真诚的眼睛看起来像柔软的天鹅绒做成的锦。他是我见过最温柔、最圣洁的人。多年后，他证明了圣心和进步的思想可以一起攀登，但是他因倡导统一佛教和基督教信仰的改革教义而被正统圣殿开除。无论是偶然还是有意，这位思想开阔的祭司是我思想开阔但保守的父亲为我挑选的老师。
The room was wide and light, and was separated from the garden porch by a row of sliding paper doors, crossed with slender bars of wood. The black-bordered straw mats were cream-colored with time, but immaculate in their dustlessness. Books and desks were there, and in the sacred alcove hung a roll picture of Confucius. Before this was a little tweaku stand, from which arose curling mist of incense. On one side sat my teacher, his flowing gray robes lying in straight, dignified lines about his folded knees, a band of gold brocade across his shoulder, and a crystal rosary round his left wrist. His face was always pale, and his deep, earnest eyes beneath the priestly cap looked like wells of soft velvet. He was the gentlest and the saintliest men I ever saw. Years after, he proved that a holy heart and a progressive mind can climb together, for he was excommunicated from the Orthodox Temple for advocating a reformed doctrine that united the beliefs of Buddhism and Christianity, whether through accident or design. This brought mine a priest with the teacher chosen for me by my broad-minded, through conservative father.
我学习的是专门为男孩准备的书，因为女孩学习中国经典是非常不寻常的。我的第一堂课来自孔子四书，这些是《大学》，他教导人们明智地运用知识来获得美德；《易经》论述宇宙法则的不可改变；《论语》和《孟子》由孔子的自传、轶事和谚语组成，由他的弟子收集。当时我只有6岁，当然，我没有从这些沉重的阅读中得到任何想法。我的脑子里充满了许多话，其中隐藏着伟大的思想，但它们当时对我来说毫无意义。有时我会对一个半截的想法感到好奇，就问老师他的意思。他的回答总是这样：冥想将解开语句中的想法，或者是100次阅读会揭示意义。有一次他对我说，你太年轻了，无法理解孔子深厚的道理。这无疑是真的，但我喜欢我的课程。在那些毫无意义的语句中，有一种音乐般的节奏。我很快地一页又一页地学习，直到我完全掌握了这4本书中所有重要的段落，能把它们背诵出来，就像一个孩子在玩技术游戏时发出的毫无意义的叮当声一样。然而，这些忙碌的时间并没有被浪费。多年来，这位伟大的老哲学家的辉煌思想逐渐在我脑海中浮现。有时，当一段记忆深刻的段落飘进我的脑海时，它的意义就像一缕突如其来的阳光一样闪烁着。
My studies were from books intended only for boys, as it was very unusual for a girl to study Chinese classics. My first lesson were from the 4 books of Confucius. These are Daigaku, Great Learning, which teaches that the wise use of knowledge leads to virtue; Chuyo, the Unchanging Center, which treats of the unalterableness of universal law; Rungo and Moshi, which consist of the autobiography, anecdotes, and sayings of Confucius gathered by his disciples. I was only 6 years old, and of course, I got no one idea from this heavy reading. My mind was filled with many words in which were hidden grand thoughts, but they meant nothing to me then. Sometimes I would feel curious about a half-caught idea and ask my teacher the meaning. He replied invariably, meditation will untangle thoughts from words, or 100 times reading reveals the meaning. Once he said to me, you're too young to comprehend the profoundly deep books of Confucius. This was undoubtedly true, but I loved my lessons. There was a certain rhythmic cadence and the meaningless words that was like music, and I learned readily page after page until I knew perfectly all the important passages of the 4 books and could recite them as a child rattles off the senseless jingle of a counting out game. Yet those busy hours were not wasted. In the years since, the splendid thoughts of the grand old philosopher have gradually dawned upon me, and sometimes, when a well-remembered passage has drifted into my mind, the meaning has come flashing like a sudden ray of sunshine.
我的祭司老师在教导这些书时，就像他面对自己的宗教一样，充满敬畏。也就是说，所有世俗舒适的想法都收起来了。在我的课上，尽管有谦卑的愿望，但他还是不得不坐在仆人带给他的厚厚的丝绸垫子上，因为垫子是我们的椅子，而教师的地位是如此尊贵，他不能坐在和他的学生一样高的位置上。在我2个小时的课堂中，除了手和嘴唇外，他从不移动1寸。我以同样正确和不变的姿势坐在他面前的垫子上。有一次，我移动了，当时正在上课，出于某种原因，我焦躁不安，微微摇晃着身体，让我折叠的膝盖从适当的角度滑出一点点。我老师的脸上闪过微弱的惊讶，然后他非常安静地合上书，温柔但严肃地说：“小小姐，很明显，你今天的状态不适合学习，你应该退回到你的房间冥想。”我的小心脏几乎羞愧得要命，但我无能为力。我谦卑地向孔子的画像鞠躬，然后向老师鞠躬，恭敬地从房间里退了出来。像往常一样，在课程结束时，我慢慢地去父亲那里报告。父亲很惊讶，因为时间还没有到。他无意识地说：“你完成工作的速度真快，就像丧钟一样。直到今天，那一刻的记忆就像淤伤一样痛。”
My priest teacher taught these books with the same reverence that he taught his religion, that is, with all thought of worldly comfort put away. During my lesson, he was obliged, despite the humble wish, to sit on the thick silk cushion the servant brought him, for cushions with our chairs, and the position of instructor was too greatly revered for him to be allowed to sit on a level with his pupil. But throughout my 2-hour lesson, he never moved the slightest fraction of an inch, except with his hands and his lips. And I sat before him on the matting in an equally correct and unchanging position. Once I moved, it was in the midst of a lesson. For some reason, I was restless and swayed my body slightly, allowing my folded knee to slip a trifle from the proper angle. The faintest shade of surprise crossed my instructor's face. Then, very quietly, he closed his book, saying gently but with a stern air, "Little miss, it is evident that your mental attitude today is not suited for study. you should retire yourself to the room and meditate. My little heart was almost killed with shame. There was nothing I could do. I humbly bowed to the picture of Confucius and then to my teacher, and backing respectfully from the room, I slowly went to my father to report, as I always did at the close of my lesson. Father was surprised, as the time was not up yet, and his unconscious remark, "How quickly you have done your work," was like a death knell. The memory of that moment hurts like a bruise to this very day.
由于在学习时没有身体上的舒适是祭司和老师的习惯，当然，所有境界较低的人都逐渐感受到身体上的困难意味着心灵上的灵感。因此，我最难和最长的课程被故意安排在仲冬的30天，也就是日历上所说的1年中最冷的日子。第9天被认为是最严厉的，所以我们在这一天学习要特别认真。我记得某一天是这个第9天，那时我妹妹大约14岁，她正准备结婚，因此为她选择的任务是缝纫，我的是书法。在那个年代，书法被认为是最重要的文化研究之一。这与其说是因为它的艺术性，尽管练习日本书法确实与绘画一样具有强烈的艺术魅力，不如说是人们相信对意念控制方面最高的训练来自于对复杂书法的耐心练习。一种漫不经心或焦躁不安的心境总是会在表意文字错综复杂的阴影中暴露出来，因为每个表意文字都需要绝对的稳定性和笔触准确性，因此在手的精心指导下，我们这些孩子被教导要用动作牵着心灵。随着第9天日出的第一缕光芒，医师来叫醒我。那天非常冷，他帮我穿衣服，然后我收集好工作需要的物品，把大张的纸堆在桌子上，用一块方巾小心地擦拭墨盒里的每件物品。当时的日本人对学习的崇敬之意非常强烈，甚至连我们使用的工具也被认为是神圣的。在这一天，我本应该自己做所有的事情，但我善良的医师徘徊在我身边，尽他所能提供帮助。最后，我们去了俯瞰花园的门廊，到处都是厚厚的雪。我还记得那片竹林的样子，羽毛状的枝头被雪覆盖着，就像宽阔的雨伞。有1-2次会听到一声尖锐的开裂声，看到一大片松软的雪喷在灰色的天空上，这说明树干被沉重的负担压垮了。医师把我背在背上，脚上蹬着雪地靴，慢慢地走到我可以触碰一棵树的低矮树枝的地方。我从树上举起一把完全纯净刚从天上降下来的未被触及的雪，然后我融化了它们，用作我的书法学习。我应该自己走去拿雪，但是医师帮我做到了。由于缺乏身体的舒适意味着心灵的灵感，我当然是在没有火的房间里写的。我们的建筑起源于热带， 因此，由于缺乏燃烧着木炭的小木盆，温度降至室外的温度。日本图画书写是缓慢而谨慎的工作。那天晚上，我在不知不觉中冻伤了手指，直到我回头一看，看到我的好护士看着我紫色的手，轻轻地哭泣。在那些日子里，对孩子的训练，即使是我这个年龄的孩子，也是严厉的。直到我完成任务，他和我都没有动。然后医师把我裹在一件暖和的大棉和服里，急忙带我进了祖母的房间。在那里，我发现了一碗祖母亲手做的温暖甜美的粥。我把冻僵的膝盖塞进盖在火箱上的软棉被下，我喝着粥，而医师用血摩擦着我僵硬的手。当然，这种严格纪律的必要性从未受到任何人的质疑，但我认为，因为我是一个娇弱的孩子，它有时会引起我母亲的不安。有一次，我走进她和父亲正在谈话的房间。
Since absence of bodily comfort while studying was the custom for priests and teachers, of course all lesser people grew to feel that hardship of body meant inspiration of mind. For this reason, my studies were purposely arranged so that the hardest lessons and longest hours came during the 30 days of midwinter, which the calendar calls the coldest of the year. The 9th day is considered the most severe, so we were expected to be especially earnest in our study on that day. I'll remember a certain 9th day when my sister was about 14 years old. She was preparing to be married. Therefore, the task selected for her was sewing. Mine was penmanship. In those days, penmanship was considered one of the most important studies for culture. This was not so much for his heart. Although it is true that practicing Japanese penmanship holds the same intense artistic fascination as does the painting of pictures, but it was believed that the highest training and mental control came from patient practice and the complicated brushstrokes of character writing. A careless or perturbed state of mind always betrays itself in the intricate shading of ideographs, for each one requires absolute steadiness and accuracy of touch. Thus, in careful guidance of the hand, were we children taught to hold in leash the mind. When the first gleam of sunrise on this 9th day, Ishi came to wake me. It was bitterly cold. She helped me dress. Then I gathered together the materials for my work, arranging the big sheets of paper in a pile on my desk and carefully wiping every article in my ink box with a square of silk. Reverence for learning was so strong in Japan at that time that even the tools we used were considered almost sacred. I was supposed to do everything for myself on this day, but my kind Ishi hovered around me, helping in every way she could without actually doing the work herself. Finally, we went to the porch overlooking the garden. The snow was deep everywhere. I remember how the bamboo grove looked with its feathery tops, so snow-laden that they were like widespread umbrellas. Once or twice, a sharp crack and a great soft fluff of spurting snow against the gray sky told that a trunk had snapped under its too heavy burden. As she took me on her back and pushing her feet into her snow boots, slowly waded to where I could reach the low branch of a tree, from which I lifted a handful of perfectly pure, untouched snow, just from the sky. This I melted to mix for my penmanship study. I ought to have waited to get the snow myself, but Ishi did it. Since the absence of bodily comfort meant inspiration of mind, of course, I wrote in a room without a fire. Our architecture of tropical origin, so the lack of the little brazier of glowing charcoal brought the temperature down to that of outside. Japanese picture writing is slow and careful work. I froze my fingers that morning without knowing it until I looked back and saw my good nurse softly crying as she watched my purple hand. The training of children, even of my age, was strict in those days, and neither she nor I moved until I had finished my task. Then Ishi wrapped me in a big padded kimono that had been warmed and hurried me into my grandmother's room.
尊敬的丈夫，他说，我有时会大胆地怀疑，对于一个不太强壮的孩子来说，月宝的学习是不是有点太严厉了？父亲把我拉到他的靠垫旁，把手轻轻地放在我的肩膀上。我们绝不能忘记，妻子，他回答说，一个武士的家庭教育，母狮把他的幼崽推下悬崖，看着他慢慢地从山谷爬回来，没有任何怜悯的表情。尽管他为这个小生物感到心痛，但只有这样，他才能为自己的毕生事业获得力量。因为我正在接受一个男孩的训练和学习，这是我的家人养成叫我艾苏博，也就是月宝的习惯原因之一。不常被用作男孩的名字，就像口是用于女孩的名字一样，但我的课程并不局限于男孩。我还学会了教给姐姐们的所有家务技能，缝纫、编织、刺绣、烹饪、插花，以及复杂的礼仪茶道。尽管如此，我的人生也不全是功课。我在玩耍中度过了许多快乐的时光。按照旧日本的传统，我们孩子每个季节都有特定的游戏。早春温暖潮湿的日子，夏天的黄昏，清爽芬芳的收获季节，或者冬天晴朗寒冷的穿雪靴的日子。我相信我们玩过的每一个游戏，我都玩得很开心。从简单的冬夜消遣，像一堆米糕扔一根螺纹针，看看我们每个人能在它的线上收集多少，再到用各种诗卡进行激动人心的记忆比赛。
Honorable husband, she was saying, I am sometimes so bold as to wonder if Itsubo's studies are not a little severe for a not too strong child. My father drew me over to his cushion and rested his hand gently on my shoulder. "We must not forget, wife," he replies, "the teaching of a samurai home. The lioness pushes her young over the cliff and watches it climb slowly back from the valley without one sign of pity, though her heart aches for the little creature, so only can it gain strength for its life work." Because I was having the training and studies of a boy was one of the reasons my family got in the habit of calling me Itsubo, the termination bo being used for a boy's name, as ko is for girls. But my lessons were not confined to those for a boy. I also learned all the domestic accomplishments taught by my sisters: sewing, weaving, embroidery, cooking, flower arranging, and the complicated etiquette of ceremonial tea. Nevertheless, my life was not all lessons. I spent many happy hours in play. With the conventional order of old Japan, we children had certain games for each season: the warm, damp days of early spring, the twilight evenings of summer, the crisp, fragrant harvest time, or the clear, cold snowshoe days of winter. And I believe I enjoyed every game we ever played, from the simple winter evening pastime of throwing a threaded needle at a pile of rice cakes to see how many each of us could gather on her string, to the exciting memory contests with our various games of poem cards.
我们也玩了喧闹的游戏，一大群人，当然都是女孩子，会聚集在某个大花园或安静的街道上，那里的房子都被竹子和常青树的树篱包围着，然后我们会在山中狐女或寻宝记中赛跑和旋转，在静止的骑高步竹马或单腿瘸子这种跳跃游戏中，我们会一边踩着高跷蹒跚而行，一边大喊大叫。但是无论是在短暂的夏季进行的户外活动，还是在漫长的冬季进行的室内游戏，对我来说都没有故事那么珍贵。仆人们知道无数从过去几代人口中口口相传下来的祭司故事和奇奇怪怪的歌谣，而医师，这个记忆力最好、口才最好的人，拥有无穷无尽的简单的古老传说。不听他讲故事，我是不会入睡的。祖母讲的那些庄严的故事非常精彩，而我坐在他面前的席子上，双手合十，度过的快乐时光。因为祖母和我说话时，我从来不用垫子，给我留下了持久而美好的回忆。但医师的故事却完全不同。我听着他们的谈话，都是温暖舒适的，蜷缩在我柔软的靠垫上，咯咯地笑着，打断他们，恳求再来一个， 直到不受欢迎的时刻到来，医师严厉地笑着，伸手去拿我的夜灯，把一个灯芯推到油里，再把另一个拉直，然后放下纸板，最后在阴暗房间里苍白柔和的灯光的包围下，我不得不说声晚安，然后安顿进 Kinoji。 这是每个武士女孩都该有的睡姿。
We had boisterous games too, in which a group, all girls of course, would gather in some large garden or on a quiet street where the houses were hemmed in behind hedges of bamboo and evergreen. Then we would race and roll, and the fox women from the mountain were hunting for hidden treasure. We would shout and scream as we tottered around on stilts, and the forbidden boy game of riding the high-stepping bamboo horse, or the hopping game of the one-legged cripples. But no outdoor play of our short summers, nor any indoor game of our long winters was so dear to me as were stories. The servants knew numberless priest tales and odd jingles that had come down by word of mouth from past generations. And Ishi, who had the best memory and the reader's tone of them all, possessed an unending fund of simple old legends. I don't remember ever going to sleep without stories from her untiring lips. The dignified tales of Honorable Grandmother were wonderful, and the happy hours I spent sitting with primly folded hands on the mat before her, for I never used a cushion when Grandmother was talking to me, have left lasting and beautiful memories. But with Ishi's stories, everything was different. I listened to them, all warm and comfortable, snuggled up crookedly in the soft cushions of my bed, giggling and interrupting and begging for just one more, until the unwelcome time would arrive when Ishi, laughing but stern, would reach over to my night lantern, push one wick down into the oil, straighten the other, and drop the paper panel. Then, at last, surrounded by the pale, soft light of the shaded room, I had to say good night and settle myself into the kinoji, which was the proper sleeping position for every samurai girl.